Shalom Chaverim, this is our fourth YouTube in which I'm discussing the situation with Russia, Ukraine and Crimea. And I know many of you would like a 15-minute YouTube where I say everything, but this subject is so close to my heart that I feel I would not be doing justice unless I gave the full story of what's happening. What I tried to do in the first three YouTubes is talk about my personal insights into what is happening today in Poland, in Ukraine, and in Russia. Talk about the history of the struggles between the Catholics and the Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox Church, to talk about the struggles between the East European nations and the Turks. This is a very complex situation over a period of 1,000 years. So what I wanted to do now is to talk about how Russia developed from a nation that conquered the Ukrainians, a nation that conquered the Poles and other East European nations, to a nation that eventually moves eastward all the way to the Pacific Ocean, all the way across Siberia, fighting the Turks, fighting the Iranians, fighting the Mongols, fighting the Koreans, fighting the Japanese. Just as Americans, most Americans who understand American history, know the term manifest destiny. Manifest destiny means a destiny which cannot be changed. It is a destiny that is going to manifest itself no matter what you do, it's going to happen. So the American colonists went from the original 13 colonies on the East Coast clear across to the Pacific Coast. It took hundreds of years, but America eventually went from coast to coast. Similarly, the Russians also reached the Pacific Ocean, going eastward, and conquering any nation that stood in its way. You know, I have to tell you, in early February this year, 2014, actually the day before I was leaving Israel to go to America for a 2-month lecture circuit, I had the opportunity to watch the Israeli TV, and the Israeli TV was interviewing an Israeli Circassian. Now, for those who live in Israel, we all know what the Circassians are. Circassians are Israelis, just like they're Turks or Russians or any other people. The Circassians were a nation that lived where the Olympics took place in Sochi. Now, I know all of you who are watching this YouTube remember the Russian Olympics in Sochi. And you think, oh, Sochi, it's a Russian city. It is a Russian city. But in Sochi, there's a hill called the Red Hill. You know, so those who are unaware of the history would say, oh, Red Hill because it's Red Communist Russia, Soviet Union. No, the reason it was called Red Hill was because of the blood of 3 million Circassians who were massacred by the Tsarist army in 1854. And so this Circassian, who served in the Israeli army, was telling the history of the war with the Russians. The Russians were massacring the Circassians. 3 million of them. That's a Holocaust. As a result of this Holocaust, many Circassians, who are Turkic Muslims, fled to Turkey. They were mercenaries, they were professional soldiers. They joined the Sultan's army, the Sultan of Turkey, and many of them got dispatched to the land of Israel, which at that time was just southern Turkey. When Israel received its independence in 1948 and fought its independence war, these Circassians, who are Muslims, by the way, Sunni Muslims, Turks, they fought in the Israeli army. They stayed in Israel. And we have 2 villages in the north of Israel, which are today Circassian towns. And the Circassians, they're Israelis in every sense of the word. They may be Muslim. They're not Arabs. They are Turkic. And so this young man gave this interview on Israeli TV. I think it's extremely enlightening to understand the history of the Circassians and how they were basically butchered and fled from Russia into Turkey and then by extension to the land of Israel. You've all heard of Crimea. Crimea is an extremely strategic area for Russia. And the original inhabitants of Crimea were a group called the Tatars. The Tatars are another Turkish group. The Tatars lived in the Crimea. Don't forget, the Crimea is the north shore of the Black Sea. Now, the entire Black Sea was under Turkish rule. We can't forget Bulgaria, which is an Orthodox Christian country, used to be part of Ottoman Turkey. Romania, Orthodox Christian country, was part of Turkey. and the southern coast of Ukraine was Turkey. And Sochi, which is the eastern part of the Black Sea, was Turkey. The Black Sea was basically a Turkish lake. So the Tatars lived there. Many Tatars actually became fully integrated in the Russian military and Russian army, even though they were Muslims and Turkic. In World War II, when the Nazis occupied the Crimea, many Tatars who were Muslims and Turks sided with the Nazis. And without criticizing them for this, I will say one thing. It is a very well-known fact that the Turks admire Germany. The Iranians also admire Germany. And maybe there's something in the characters of the Turks and the Iranians similar to the German character there. I would say the militaristic and, how shall I say, organized military way of thinking. Westernization, the Germans were the role models for the Turks and the Iranians. So when Stalin came back with the Red Army and defeated the Russians in 1944, or rather liberated Crimea, the Tatars were all expelled into the hinterland of Russia, hinterland of the Soviet Union, and they were basically like the American Indians. The Native Americans were settled in reservations, so the Tatars were moved into a semi-autonomous republic known as Tatarstan. And the ironic thing is they found oil. The Muslims found oil in the heart of Russia there. But the important thing that I want to share now is that the Tatars have a very strong historic memory. And the Tatars, little by little, began to leave Tatarstan. So they were in Tatarstan, but they also returned to Crimea. And today you have 400,000 Turkic Tatars living in Crimea. And they basically feel, like the Jews returning home to the land of Israel, the Tatars felt that the Crimea was their land of Israel. They're coming back. And that's the second Turkic group that they had cooperation with the Russians at some times, and they had war with the Russians at some times. And then the third group I want to talk about are the Circassians. Not Circassians, Chechens. You've all heard of Chechnya. You've all heard of the bombers, the Boston bombers. They were Chechens, they were Muslims. And these people had been fighting the Russians stubbornly for hundreds of years. When I studied Russian, one of the books I read as a Russian studies student was Geroi Nasheva Vremeni, Hero for Our Times, by Lermontov. If you can get it in English, you should try to read it. Every Russian student in Russia today, or anyone who studies Russian, this is required reading. Lermontov was a Russian officer who actually died at age 27 in a duel over a romantic affair. He died in a duel. And by age 27, he wrote this book, which I would say helped to shape the Russian character. And in his book, he writes about the wars with the Chechens and the Circassians and the Tatars and all these different groups. This is deeply embedded in the psyche of the Russian people, that the Russians are superior, the Russians are conquerors, and they have conquered and subdued these Turkic nations. So we're going to come back to this later when we talk about the Islamic aspect of the confrontation with Russia, which is also extremely important. What I wanted to do now is to shift gears a little bit and go over to the early 1900s. And as I said before, my grandfather, Joshua Kamian, served in the Polish army. After World War I, the Germans were defeated. The League of Nations, Treaty of Versailles, established, or shall I say resurrected, an independent nation known as Poland. And immediately Poland was attacked by the communists. We can't forget the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And so the Polish were virulently anti-communist. Poland, it was a Catholic country, and the Catholics didn't like, neither did the Russian Orthodox Church, they didn't like Bolshevism. And what we saw happening was a war in which my grandfather, who had been trained by the German army, was now helping to fight against the communists. And then from there, after that, in the 1920s, he emigrated to Poland and to Argentina, and then took my mother and my grandmother and the whole family there to Argentina. So what I wanted to do now, this is very critical to understand. is the foundation of communism and socialism in the 1800s, and the very, very proactive participation by Jews in the socialist and communist movements in those countries. I don't know how many of you remember Fiddler on the Roof. I'm sure many of you, if you were in the same room with me, would raise your hands. Oh yes, we all saw Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler on the Roof talks about Tevye, a milkman, Jewish milkman in the countryside, probably of the Ukraine, and pogroms and horrible things that happen. And there's one part there where Tevye throws his arms up in the air and he talks to God. He says, God, you know, you call the Jewish people the chosen people. Well, why can't you choose some other people for once? And the reason he said that was because the Jewish people were suffering so greatly from the Tsarist regime that many, many Jews opted out of the religion. Many Jews fled from Russia to Argentina, to the United States, to Palestine, the land of Israel. Jews were fleeing from Russia in massive numbers to get away from the persecution. But there was another type of Jew that didn't want to leave, and that Jew joined a movement known as the communist or socialist or Bolshevik movements. The idea being, and again, it's not that I'm preaching Christianity, but I have to explain something very deep in the heart of Christians. In the book of Ephesians for Christians, it says that all men now who believe in Jesus are a new man in Christ. In other words, Jew, Muslim, Greek, any nation, once you're a Christian, it doesn't matter your background, you're all united as one in a new system. Well, this new movement known as socialism and communism said, no. We're going to abolish God because the only thing that God brings us is trouble. And we're going to establish a communist movement and where there is no God, and therefore this is the great equalizer. All people, whether they be Jew, Christian, Arab, Muslim, Turk, or whatever, Chinese, as long as you believe in the Marxist communist ideology, we're all equal. And so that's kind of like the communist anti-parallel to the Christian Ephesians teaching of the one new man in Christ. So now the communists had the one new man in Marx. And of course, as the communists came to power in Russia, they suppressed all religion. They suppressed Judaism, they suppressed Christianity, they suppressed Islam. So the war against Ukraine in 1917, when the Bolshevik Revolution took over Russia, Ukrainians immediately declared independence. The Polish now had independence. And so the communists, all of a sudden, this is parallel to what Putin is doing today. They're saying, we broke away from Russia, we have our independence, but the Russian nation said, no, we're going to get you back into our federation, or the Soviet Union, or whatever you want to call it. And so, who was amongst the great leaders of the communists, socialists, and Bolsheviks? It was the Jewish people. And in 1917, 18, 1920, you had a great civil war in Russia. And if you remember, I mentioned in a previous YouTube the name of Khmelnytsky. Well, after World War I, the Ukrainians rose in revolt, and their leader was Semyon Fiddler. Semyon Fiddler killed 100,000 Jews in the Ukraine. And it was the great ideological Zionist mentor, Zev Jabotinsky, who said in the 1920s, liquidate the diaspora or the diaspora will liquidate you. Because he saw what was happening in Ukraine. And Jabotinsky predicted that something like this was going to happen throughout Europe. And the Jews were not listening. The Jews could not believe for a moment. And I know the time is running out, but I do want to say, this is going to happen throughout the West very soon with an Islamic plan to destroy the Jews and the Christians who are with the Jews. So we will continue with the 5th YouTube, and basically we're going to wrap up what's happening now with Russia, Ukraine, Crimea.